New Orleans in 1918, and the first attacks. New Orleans in the late 1910s was a city unlike any other in America. It was a place where cultures collided. French, Spanish, African, Italian, and American traditions all wove together into something uniquely vibrant. Jazz music poured out of bars and dance halls on nearly every corner. The French Quarter bustled with life, and the working-class neighborhood spread out from the city center in a sprawling mixture of shotgun houses, corner stores, and churches. Yet beneath that vibrancy, there was an undercurrent of tension. Crime had long been a part of the city's identity. New Orleans was notorious for corruption in its police force, for gang rivalries, and for the Sicilian mafia influence that had begun in the late 19th century. Immigrant families, especially Italians and Sicilians, dominated the grocery trade, and many worked long hours in corner shops that doubled as their homes. It was within this atmosphere, bustling, colorful, but also shadowed by crime and prejudice, that one of the most terrifying murder sprees in American history began. The killer who would become known as the Axeman of New Orleans first struck in 1918, but his reign of terror was not entirely without precedent. In the years before, New Orleans had seen scattered axe murders, some linked to robberies, others unsolved. But the attacks that began in 1918 bore an eerily specific pattern, one that suggested not random violence but the work of a methodical predator. The first victims. On May 23, 1918, the Axeman's terror began with an attack on Joseph and Catherine Maggio, an Italian grocer and his wife. The Maggios lived above their corner grocery at the intersection of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets, a typical arrangement for Sicilian grocers of the time. In the early morning hours, while the couple slept, the killer crept into their bedroom. Armed with an axe, reportedly one owned by the Maggios themselves, the intruder hacked at the couple with brutal force. Catherine's throat was slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated, while Joseph's skull was smashed. Both were left for dead. The walls and sheets were splattered with blood. Yet strangely, some of the Maggios' valuables, including cash and jewelry, were untouched. The crime scene gave no clear indication of robbery as a motive. The door showed signs of forced entry, but the killer had taken the time to carefully remove a panel from the back door with a chisel. The weapon, the axe, was left behind in the house. Neighbors discovered the bodies when Joseph's brothers, Andrew and Jake Maggio, raised the alarm. They lived nearby and had been drinking late into the night. When Andrew went to check on Joseph, he was met with a gruesome scene. Catherine was already dead. Joseph would die shortly afterward from his injuries. The police were baffled. Suspicion initially fell on Andrew himself, who had been seen drinking heavily the night before and was known to have quarreled with his brother. But no evidence directly tied him to the murders. The brutality of the killings, combined with the lack of clear motive, left investigators uneasy. The city began to whisper. Was this a lone act of violence or the beginning of something more sinister? The crime pattern emerges. A few weeks later, another attack took place, this time on June 27, 1918. The victims were Louis Bessumer and his mistress, Harriet Lowe. Bessumer was a grocer, living in an apartment attached to his store. Like the Maggios, he was attacked in his sleep. The assailant struck both Bessumer and Lowe in the head with an axe. Lowe survived but was grievously injured. Her skull was fractured, and she would linger in a state of confusion and pain for weeks. Bessumer, too, survived the initial attack, though badly wounded. The crime scene was disturbingly similar to that of the Maggios. The weapon was again an axe, one belonging to the victims. The point of entry was a panel removed from a door, suggesting premeditation and patience. Nothing of value was taken. Lowe, despite her injuries, was able to speak with police. In her delirium, she accused Bessumer of being a German spy, a reflection of the paranoia of the World War I era, rather than evidence. Police briefly pursued the idea but soon abandoned it. Bessumer himself was arrested as a suspect at one point but later released. The attack deepened the sense of dread in New Orleans. Two households had been brutally assaulted in the span of a month, both connected to groceries, both in the dead of night, both with an axe. By now, the newspapers had seized on the story. The Times-Picayune ran lurid headlines describing the axe fiend and warning that a murderer was stalking the city. Citizens began to sleep uneasily, locking doors and windows, though the killer's careful removal of door panels suggested such measures might not protect them. The strange case of the Schneider family. On August 5, 1918, the Axeman struck again. This time, the victim was Mrs. Anna Schneider, a young woman in her late 20s who was 8 months pregnant. She was attacked in her home on Elmira Street in the early evening. Unlike the previous victims, Anna was not a grocer. Her attack broadened the scope of fear. She was found by her husband covered in blood, with deep cuts to her face and scalp. Miraculously, she survived, and so did her unborn child, whom she later gave birth to safely. Again, the weapon appeared to be an axe. Again, nothing valuable was taken. This attack terrified New Orleans even more. If the Axeman was no longer targeting only grocers, then truly anyone could be next. The randomness of his victims gave the impression of a predator motivated not by greed but by some darker, more inexplicable urge. The Andolini Incident. Just days later, on August 10, 1918, another Italian grocer, Joseph Romano, was attacked in his home on Tonti Street. Romano was an older man, living with his two nieces. Late at night, the nieces awoke to the sound of a struggle and found their uncle grievously wounded, his head smashed by an axe. Romano was still alive but bleeding heavily. He managed to stagger into another room before collapsing. The nieces caught a glimpse of the attacker, a tall, dark figure wearing a slouched hat. This was the first eyewitness account of the Axeman. Romano died 2 days later from his injuries. The niece's description of the killer was widely published, but it was vague enough to apply to almost anyone. Still, it added to the growing mythology of the Axeman as a shadowy, phantom-like presence slipping into homes at night. By now, the city was in full-blown panic. People began to sleep in shifts, some staying awake with shotguns at the ready. Rumors swirled about who the killer might be: a madman, a vengeful grocer, a mafia enforcer, or even something supernatural. The city trembles. The summer of 1918 left New Orleans gripped with fear. A killer was on the loose, striking unpredictably but always with a similar method. He used axes, often the victim's own. He gained entry by removing door panels with chisels, tools he left behind. He stole little or nothing, and he targeted people in their homes while they slept. The city's police were overwhelmed, and newspapers only fanned the flames of hysteria. Headlines screamed about the Axe murderer and compared the killings to Jack the Ripper's reign of terror in London. New Orleans, with its sultry nights and vibrant jazz, now seemed haunted by something far darker. And the Axeman was only just beginning. The wave of terror, 1918–1919. A city under siege. By the late summer of 1918, New Orleans was a city on edge. The brutal axe murders of Joseph and Catherine Maggio, the attack on Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe, the assault on Anna Schneider, and the killing of Joseph Romano had shaken the community. The city's immigrant population, particularly Italian and Sicilian grocers, felt targeted, while the rest of the population feared the attacks might strike anywhere, at any time. People began to bar their doors and windows at night, but many realized such precautions were little comfort. The killer had shown an unnerving ability to enter homes with ease, often by prying out wooden panels from doors with chisels. He left his tools behind, as if mocking the police with the evidence of his craft. The city's newspapers took to calling him the Axe Fiend, and soon, the Axeman. Editorials compared him to Jack the Ripper in London, suggesting New Orleans was now home to its own version of a modern boogeyman. But as 1919 began, the attacks did not stop. In fact, they escalated, spreading terror through the winter and spring until the entire city seemed to live in a state of dread. The attack on the Cortamiglias, March 1919. On the night of March 10, 1919, one of the most infamous attacks took place in the small suburb of Gretna, across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. The victims were Charles and Rosie Cortamiglia, Italian immigrants who ran a corner grocery. With them in the home was their 2-year-old daughter, Mary. Sometime in the early morning hours, the family was assaulted in their beds. Charles and Rosie were both struck with an axe, suffering severe head injuries. Mary was killed instantly, her skull crushed by a single blow. Neighbors, alerted by the family's screams, rushed to the scene and found a horrifying tableau. Charles was bleeding profusely but alive. Rosie, gravely injured, clutched her dead child in her arms, sobbing in agony. Once again, the assailant had entered by chiseling out a wooden panel from the back door. The weapon was, as usual, an axe left behind at the scene. The Cortamiglia case sent shockwaves through New Orleans. The murder of a child was a new level of brutality, even for the Axeman. Citizens were outraged, demanding answers from the police. But investigators, as before, found no clear motive. Nothing of value had been stolen. In a cruel twist, Rosie Cortamiglia accused her neighbors, Frank and Orlando Giordano, of committing the crime. She insisted she had seen them in the moments after the attack. The Giordanos, a father and son, were arrested and convicted despite weak evidence. Frank Giordano was sentenced to hang, while his elderly father received a life sentence. Many at the time, and nearly all historians today, believe the Giordanos were innocent. Rosie, suffering from trauma and head injuries, likely misidentified her attackers. Years later, she recanted her testimony, admitting she had been mistaken. But by then, the damage was done. The Axeman remained free, while innocent men languished in prison. Survivors' stories, glimpses of the Axeman. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Axeman case is that several victims survived their encounters, offering chilling glimpses of the killer. In the Romano attack, Joseph Romano's nieces described a tall man wearing a dark suit and slouched hat fleeing the house. In the Bessumer case, Harriet Lowe initially claimed she saw nothing, but later, in her delirium, suggested Bessumer himself had been her attacker. This confusion further muddled the investigation. Other survivors described waking in the night to the shadow of a man standing over their bed, or hearing footsteps retreating after the attack. But the descriptions were vague, often contradictory. The Axeman seemed to vanish into the night, leaving no trace except shattered skulls and broken families. The randomness of his attacks made him even more terrifying. While most of his victims were Italian grocers or their families, there were exceptions, like the pregnant Anna Schneider. This inconsistency kept the police from establishing a firm pattern or motive. The press and the panic. By early 1919, the New Orleans press was in a frenzy. The Times-Picayune and other papers published sensational front-page stories about each new attack, often exaggerating details to stoke fear. Editorial cartoons depicted the Axeman as a shadowy specter with a raised axe, stalking innocent families. Citizens began carrying weapons at all times. Some slept with shotguns under their beds. Italian communities, feeling especially targeted, organized neighborhood watches. Groups of men took turns patrolling the streets at night, hoping to catch the killer in the act. The panic even influenced the economy. Grocery stores, especially those run by Italian families, saw declines in business as customers grew afraid to linger after dark. Some grocers abandoned their shops entirely, moving away from New Orleans in fear. Police, under intense pressure, pursued dozens of leads, but each proved fruitless. Suspects were arrested and released. Some were accused by hysterical witnesses, only to be cleared later. Others were jailed on flimsy evidence, like the unfortunate Giordano's. The city seemed trapped in a nightmare, with no escape. The infamous letter. Then, in March 1919, New Orleans received one of the most bizarre and infamous pieces of correspondence in American true crime history. On March 13, 1919, newspapers across the city published a letter purportedly written by the Axeman himself. It was addressed to the people of New Orleans and postmarked from hell. The letter read in part, "They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. At 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe." The letter was outrageous, theatrical, and deeply unsettling. Whether or not it was truly written by the killer, it terrified the city. The idea that the Axeman, already compared to a phantom, might see himself as a demon, invisible and unstoppable, added a supernatural element to the fear. But it was his challenge that captivated people most: play jazz music on the appointed night or risk death. The night of jazz. The date given in the letter was Tuesday, March 19, 1919. On that night, New Orleans became a city of music like never before. Dance halls were filled to bursting with people seeking safety in numbers and music. Families hired bands to play in their homes. Neighbors gathered together, filling the night air with the sound of trumpets, trombones, clarinets, and drums. The entire city seemed to throb with jazz, from the French Quarter to the farthest suburbs. Some accounts even claim that street musicians walked block to block, ensuring no house went silent. And that night, true to the letter's word, no one was killed. The newspapers reveled in the story. Headlines declared New Orleans had danced its way out of death. Editorials speculated whether the Axeman had truly sent the letter or if it was a hoax by a mischievous citizen. But one fact remained: the terror was not over. The return of the Axeman. Just when New Orleans dared to believe the nightmare had ended, the Axeman struck again. On August 10, 1919, Steve Bacher, another grocer, was attacked in his home. He survived, though badly injured. Once again, the method was the same: entry through a door panel, attack with an axe, valuables untouched. A month later, on September 3, 1919, another grocer, Philomena and Mike Pepitone, were assaulted in their home. Philomena survived. Mike did not. His skull was smashed with such force that blood spattered across the walls and ceilings, shocking even veteran police officers. The Pepitone murder was the last attack widely attributed to the Axeman. After September 1919, he seemed to vanish as suddenly as he had appeared. A city forever changed. By the time the spree ended, the Axeman had attacked at least a dozen people, killing 6. Some estimates placed the number higher, linking earlier and later murders to him as well. But more than the body count, it was the fear he inspired that left the deepest mark. For nearly 2 years, New Orleans lived under siege, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the night, dreading the sight of a shadow in the doorway. The Axeman was never caught. His letter, his method, and his mystery ensured that his name would live on long after the murders stopped. The letters, panic, and the jazz night. The year 1919 was already a time of fear in New Orleans. The city was still reeling from World War I, and the deadly Spanish flu pandemic that had swept across the globe. But for the people living in the Crescent City, the specter of disease and global unrest was overshadowed by something more immediate and terrifying: the threat of the Axeman. By spring, the murders and assaults had created a climate of panic. Newspapers reported each new crime in lurid detail. Families bought new locks, reinforced their doors, and kept weapons near their bedsides. Some households took turns staying awake at night to stand guard. The idea of a killer roaming the streets, striking without warning, was bad enough. But when the Axeman decided to communicate with the public, the terror reached a fever pitch. The Letter from Hell. On March 13, 1919, the New Orleans Times-Picayune received a chilling letter that would become one of the most infamous documents in American crime history. Written in flamboyant, almost theatrical language, the letter claimed to be from the Axeman himself. The letter began dramatically. "Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether which surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." The writer mocked the police, insisting they were powerless to stop him. He described himself as an otherworldly being who could move unseen and strike at will. Whether the Axeman truly wrote the letter or it was the work of a prankster capitalizing on public fear remains unknown. What is certain is that the letter fanned the flames of hysteria across the city. But it was the next part of the letter that stunned New Orleans. "Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared whose home has a jazz band in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of those people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night will get the axe." It was unlike anything the city had ever seen. A murderer, or someone pretending to be one, had just issued a threat tied to music. The Jazz Night. The date was set, Tuesday, March 18, 1919. As that night approached, New Orleans was gripped with anticipation, fear, and a strange sense of festivity. Residents who could afford it rushed to hire musicians. Jazz bands were booked solid. Families who couldn't afford live performers made sure to play phonographs loudly in their homes. From the French Quarter to the Garden District, the sound of jazz filled the streets. Contemporary accounts describe an almost surreal atmosphere. Every corner, every cafe, every dance hall was alive with music. Families sat awake through the night, keeping the lights on and the music blaring, afraid that silence would invite the Axeman's wrath. And yet, for all the anxiety, that night became something remarkable, a citywide celebration of jazz. The music that had been born in the streets of New Orleans, often dismissed by elites as rowdy and improper, now became the shield against death. When dawn broke on March 19, the people discovered that no murders had occurred that night. The Axeman had kept his word, or perhaps had never intended to strike at all. Whatever the truth, the legend of the Axeman was cemented. Media frenzy. The story spread beyond Louisiana, capturing national attention. Newspapers in other states reprinted the Axeman's letter and described the bizarre jazz night that followed. For many Americans, it was their first introduction to both the Axeman and the music of New Orleans jazz. The letter's theatrical style, equal parts horror and humor, fascinated the public. Some compared the Axeman to Jack the Ripper, noting how both killers had taunted police and media. Others dismissed the letter as a hoax, perhaps written by someone seeking publicity or mischief. But for the people of New Orleans, there was no laughing matter. The Axeman was real. People had been killed, families shattered, lives ruined. Whether or not he wrote the letter, the fact remained that someone with an axe was stalking the city. Suspicions and theories. After the letter, the search for the Axeman intensified. Detectives investigated leads ranging from local criminals to secret societies. Some suggested the murders were the work of the mafia, targeting Italian grocers in particular. Others thought it might be a deranged vagrant, a butcher, or even someone connected to the victims' families. Kate Pepitone, the widow of one of the Axeman's victims, later claimed she knew who the killer was. On her deathbed, she reportedly named a man she said had murdered her husband. But her statement came decades after the crimes, and it was never confirmed. One theory suggested the Axeman was never a single person at all, but a copycat phenomenon, with multiple attackers mimicking each other. The similarities between attacks supported the idea of one killer, but the lack of consistency in how he struck left room for doubt. The fear intensifies. Even with the citywide jazz reprieve, the fear did not fade. Instead, it grew sharper. If the Axeman could toy with the public, if he could threaten mass murder and go unchallenged, what would he do next? In the weeks after the letter, families continued to sleep uneasily. Hardware stores reported brisk sales in locks and firearms. Some households set up makeshift traps, stringing wires across doorways or keeping buckets of water balanced on shelves to alert them of intruders. Jazz may have saved the city for one night, but no one believed the danger was over. Setting the stage for more blood. The Axeman's next strikes would prove he was not done. In the months that followed, more homes would be shattered by his blade. The letter had turned him into a legend, but the reality was far more horrifying. This was no ghost, no demon, but a flesh-and-blood killer who could not be stopped. And as the summer of 1919 approached, New Orleans braced itself for more horror, the later murders and the final attacks. The spring and summer of 1919 were supposed to be a time of renewal for New Orleans. The Spanish flu pandemic had begun to wane, the city's port was busy with post-war commerce, and jazz was gaining recognition as a cultural treasure. But none of that erased the fear that gripped the Crescent City whenever night fell. The Axeman was still out there. No one knew when, where, or how he would strike next, only that he would. The attack on the Cortamiglias. On the night of March 10, 1919, just days before his infamous letter was published, the Axeman had already left another family shattered. The victims were Charles and Rosie Cortamiglia, Italian immigrants who owned a small grocery store in Gretna, a town just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. Around midnight, neighbors were awakened by screams. When they rushed to the Cortamiglia home, they found a scene of carnage. Charles lay gravely injured, his skull fractured by axe blows. Rosie was bleeding profusely but still alive. Tragically, their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, had been killed instantly. The brutality of murdering a child shocked even a city already accustomed to horror. It confirmed the Axeman's reputation not just as a killer, but as a monster. Charles eventually recovered, but Rosie's injuries left her physically and emotionally scarred for life. In her delirium, she accused their neighbors, the Giordanos, a father and son, of committing the crime. Both men were arrested, tried, and convicted, despite weak evidence. Years later, Rosie admitted she had named them under pressure and trauma. Many now believe they were innocent, victims of fear and prejudice in a city desperate for answers. Jazz as a shield. By now, the Axeman's strange letter had already become infamous. On the night of March 18, when jazz poured from every corner of the city, many thought the Axeman might have ended his reign. But the attack on the Cortamiglias proved otherwise. Still, the jazz connection lingered. Some residents believed the killer's obsession with the music was genuine, that he would spare only those who embraced it. Others thought the letter was a cruel hoax, a psychological weapon meant to deepen the city's paranoia. Whatever the truth, New Orleans leaned into its new identity. Clubs and saloons filled with music nightly. People half-joked that jazz itself had become the city's guardian spirit, warding off evil with its syncopated rhythms. Renewed panic in the summer. By June 1919, months had passed without another attack, and for a brief time the city exhaled. But on August 10, terror returned. That night, Steve Baca, a grocer, was sleeping in his home when the Axeman struck. Steve awoke in time to see a figure fleeing into the night. He stumbled outside, blood streaming from wounds in his head. Miraculously, he survived. Only weeks later, on August 10, 1919, another attack occurred. This time the victim was Sarah Lawman, a young woman who lived alone. Neighbors, noticing her house strangely quiet, broke in and found her lying unconscious in her bed with head injuries. Though severely beaten, she too survived. The attacks seemed to follow a pattern. Italian grocers, often struck in the head with an axe or blunt object, the weapon abandoned at the scene. Yet the survivors could never give a clear description of the assailant. Sometimes they thought he was tall, other times short. Sometimes they claimed he was alone, other times they swore multiple figures fled. The inconsistencies fueled theories. Was there truly one Axeman, or were the attacks the work of different criminals, lumped together under one terrifying name? The final known attack. The last widely accepted attack attributed to the Axeman occurred on October 27, 1919. The victim was Mike Pepitone, a grocer living with his wife and children. That night, Mrs. Pepitone awoke to find her husband lying in bed, blood gushing from a fatal head wound. The bedroom walls were smeared with blood, and an axe lay discarded nearby. Mike Pepitone did not survive. The scene was one of the most gruesome yet. Neighbors rushed to the home, horrified to see the devastation. For Mrs. Pepitone, the tragedy was compounded by the presence of her 6 children, who had to witness their father's bloody death. This attack, perhaps more than any other, underscored the senselessness of the Axeman's crimes. There was no robbery, no clear motive, only slaughter. The case collapses. After Pepitone's murder, the Axeman seemed to vanish. Weeks passed, then months. The fear gradually subsided, though never fully. Families continued to lock their doors and keep watch, but the city slowly returned to its rhythms. Police had little to show for years of investigation. Dozens of suspects had been questioned, and several arrested, but no one was ever convincingly tied to the crimes. The Giordanos remained imprisoned for years before eventually being released, their reputations destroyed. Theories swirled endlessly. Some pointed to a man named Joseph Momfer, said to be a petty criminal with mafia connections. According to one later account, Mrs. Pepitone herself shot and killed Momfer in Los Angeles in 1921, claiming he had been her husband's murderer. Yet historians debate the truth of this story. Records of Momfer's life and death are murky, and many suspect the tale was exaggerated or invented. Others argued the Axeman was never caught because he simply moved on, perhaps continuing his crimes elsewhere under different circumstances. The similarities between the Axeman murders and other axe killings in the South, such as in Texas and along the Gulf Coast, give weight to the idea of a traveling killer. The end of the nightmare. By early 1920, the Axeman's reign was over, whether by death, imprisonment, or simple disappearance. New Orleans moved on, but the scars remained. The victims' families never received true justice, and the city was left with a legend rather than a resolution. For survivors like Rosie Cortimiglia, the trauma lasted a lifetime. For widows like Mrs. Pepitone, the pain was compounded by endless questions. Who killed their loved ones and why? The Axeman had become more than a criminal. He was a ghost story told in a city already rich with legends of the supernatural. His mysterious letter, his bizarre demand for jazz, and his vanishing act cemented him as a figure who seemed less like a man and more like a phantom haunting the streets. Looking ahead to the legend. Though the murders stopped, the fascination never did. Over time, the Axeman became part of New Orleans folklore, as entwined with the city's identity as Mardi Gras or Voodoo. In the decades to come, writers, musicians, and storytellers would. Legacy of the Axeman. When the blood-stained autumn of 1919 gave way to 1920, New Orleans found itself at a crossroads. The fear that had once gripped the city like a vice began to ease. Families stopped keeping weapons under their pillows, shopkeepers stopped hearing armed guards, and children once again played freely in the streets after dark. Yet the memory of the Axeman lingered, not as a fading nightmare, but as a legend that grew stronger with every passing year. The Axeman had never been caught, his identity never proven. And in that absence of closure, he transformed from a criminal into a folkloric figure, part man, part myth, forever tethered to the soul of New Orleans. A city of ghosts and legends. New Orleans was already a city steeped in mystery. Its history was a tapestry woven from French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences. Ghost stories, voodoo tales, and eerie folklore thrived in its neighborhoods. Against this backdrop, the Axeman fit perfectly. Unlike Jack the Ripper, who haunted the foggy streets of London, or H.H. Holmes, who built his murder castle in Chicago, the Axeman's theater of blood was a city defined by music, passion, and shadowy intrigue. His crimes were horrific, but the bizarre Jazz Letter elevated him into something other than just a murderer. He became a character in the city's living mythology. Tour guides would one day walk visitors through the French Quarter and Lower Garden District, retelling the story of the night when everyone played jazz to save their lives. To this day, ghost tours still include the Axeman, weaving his tale alongside stories of haunted mansions and voodoo priestesses. The jazz connection. Perhaps the most enduring part of the Axeman legend is his strange love of jazz. Whether the letter was authentic or not, it forever linked the killer with the music that defined New Orleans. That surreal night of March 18, 1919, became a cornerstone of the city's cultural memory. For one night, fear turned into celebration, and music drowned out the darkness. Musicians later wrote songs inspired by the Axeman, blending fact and fiction. In 1919 itself, a tune titled The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz Don't Scare Me Papa was published, playing directly on the notoriety of the case. The sheet music featured a cartoonish figure wielding an axe, smiling while surrounded by dancing notes. It was macabre, playful, and uniquely New Orleans, a city that could transform terror into art. Influence on true crime history. From a criminology standpoint, the Axeman stands out as one of America's earliest examples of a media-fueled serial killer panic. While earlier killers like H.H. Holmes, Jesse Pomeroy, and the Austin Servant Girl Annihilator had shocked the public, the Axeman showed how newspapers could amplify both fear and fascination. The lurid headlines, the constant speculation, and especially the publication of his so-called letter created a frenzy. In this way, the Axeman was a predecessor to later killers who would seek attention, like the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s, who also taunted police and media with cryptic messages. Unlike Zodiac, though, the Axeman's voice came through only once. That single letter was enough to define him forever. The victims remembered. Behind the legend, however, were real lives lost and shattered. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, May 1918, butchered in their bedroom, their deaths marking the Axeman's bloody arrival. Louis and Anna Bessumer, June 1918. Anna succumbed to her injuries. Louis lived but was scarred. Joseph Romano, August 1918, struck down in his home, his nieces traumatized by the sight of his murder. Charles Rossi and Mary Cortimiglia, March 1919. Mary, only 2 years old, killed in her bed. Rossi survived but carried guilt and pain for life. Sarah Lawman, August 1919, barely survived her attack, forever marked by her injuries. Mike Pepitone, October 1919. His bloody death left a widow and 6 children. Their names remind us that the Axeman was not just a legend, but a human predator whose violence left a trail of grief. Comparisons to other killers. Historians and criminologists often compare the Axeman to Jack the Ripper. Both were never caught, both taunted the media, and both faded into mystery. But there are important differences. Jack the Ripper targeted prostitutes in London's East End, while the Axeman seemed to focus largely on Italian grocers in New Orleans. Some saw this as evidence of ethnic prejudice, that the killer harbored hatred for immigrants. Others argued the choice was practical. Small grocers were easy targets, their homes often attached to their shops, and they kept cash on hand. The Axeman is also sometimes compared to the servant girl annihilator, an unidentified killer who struck in Austin, Texas, in the 1880s. Both killers wielded axes, both attacked sleeping families, and both vanished without a trace. Some even speculated, without evidence, that the same man could have been behind both sprees, traveling across decades and states. From fear to folklore. As the years passed, the Axeman ceased to be a living fear and became a story. Newspapers occasionally revisited the crimes, especially on anniversaries. Writers used the Axeman as shorthand for mysterious evil. By the mid-20th century, his name was invoked alongside other American legends of horror. Unlike killers who were caught and defined by their trials, the Axeman remained a shadow. His very absence made him more haunting. In the 21st century, the Axeman gained new fame thanks to television and popular culture. The TV show American Horror Story, Coven 2013, featured the Axeman as a character, blending fact and fiction into a supernatural narrative. While sensationalized, it introduced millions of viewers to the legend, ensuring his place in the pantheon of true crime icons. A legacy of fear and music. The Axeman's legacy is a paradox. His crimes were horrific, but his letter inspired one of the most joyous, music-filled nights in New Orleans history. The city that had been paralyzed by fear danced and played together, united by jazz. For this reason, some locals speak of the Axeman with a strange mix of dread and pride. He was a murderer, yes, but also a figure who inadvertently showcased the resilience and creativity of New Orleans. The Jazz Night remains one of the most unique episodes in crime history. A killer declaring his fondness for music, and an entire city responding in harmony. Closing the chapter. By the 1920s, the Axeman was gone. Whether dead, imprisoned, or simply moved on, he never struck New Orleans again. But he left behind a story too strange, too chilling, and too uniquely New Orleans to ever fade. The Axeman became more than a killer, he became a legend. And in a city of legends, his story was destined to endure, theories, myths. And why the Axeman still fascinates today. The story of the Axeman of New Orleans is not simply a tale of murders. It is also a tale of mystery, speculation, and the power of legend. Because the killer was never caught, his identity became a blank canvas upon which generations have projected theories, fears, and imaginations. More than a century later, the Axeman remains one of the most chilling and captivating figures in American true crime. The main theories. 1. The Mafia connection. One of the earliest and most enduring theories suggested that the Axeman was connected to organized crime. Many of his victims were Italian grocers, and some believed the murders were linked to extortion schemes run by the Mafia or the Black Hand, criminal societies that preyed on immigrant communities. However, the brutality of the attacks, smashing skulls with an axe while families slept, seemed less like calculated business and more like frenzied violence. Most historians dismiss the Mafia theory as unlikely, though it reflects the prejudices of the time against Italian immigrants. 2. Joseph Momfer. The most famous suspect in Axeman lore is Joseph Momfer, a small-time criminal with alleged ties to organized crime. According to one account, Momfer was later shot and killed in Los Angeles in 1921 by Esther Pepitone, the widow of the Axeman's final known victim, Mike Pepitone. The story goes that Esther identified Momfer as her husband's killer and exacted revenge. Newspapers at the time reported her arrest, but records are inconsistent, and some historians argue the story was exaggerated or even fabricated. If true, Momfer could have been the Axeman, but there is no solid evidence linking him directly to the crimes. Still, the tale of Esther's vengeance adds another layer of myth to the case. 3 multiple killers. Another theory suggests that the Axeman was not one person at all, but several different criminals whose crimes were lumped together under a single name. The attacks varied in severity, motive, and method. Some involved theft, others did not. Some victims died instantly, others survived. The inconsistency supports the possibility of copycats, opportunists, or unrelated crimes being linked by newspapers eager for a sensational story. Yet the use of axes, the nighttime attacks, and the targeting of grocers gave the crimes a consistency that made many believe in a single culprit. 4. A deranged drifter. Some historians propose the Axeman was a transient laborer or drifter, passing through New Orleans during the post-war years. The city's bustling port and rail connections made it easy for someone to arrive, kill, and disappear without a trace. This theory is supported by similar axe murders that occurred in other southern states during the same era, such as Texas and Louisiana's neighboring parishes. Could the Axeman have been part of a larger wave of unsolved axe killings across the Gulf Coast? 5. The supernatural angle. Because of the letter's bizarre language, claiming to be a demon from hell, who loved jazz, some in New Orleans half-joked, half-believed that the Axeman was not human at all. In a city famous for its ghost stories, voodoo traditions, and Gothic imagination, the Axeman became another spirit in the pantheon of local legends. To some, he was the devil himself, wandering the Crescent City with an axe in hand, sparing only those who honored him with music. Why the Axeman still haunts us. 1. The Letter. Without the infamous letter, the Axeman might have faded into history as just another violent criminal. But that one piece of writing elevated him into legend. It was theatrical, arrogant, and bizarre. It transformed the killer into a character, a trickster, a demon, a madman with a taste for jazz. Few criminals in history have ever written such a strange ultimatum to the public, and fewer still have inspired a citywide response. 2. The Jazz Night. The night of March 18, 1919, is unlike anything else in crime history. Imagine an entire city, united in fear, filling the air with music to appease a killer. It is a story so surreal it sounds fictional, yet it really happened. That night not only deepened the legend of the Axeman but also highlighted the resilience and spirit of New Orleans. The city took terror and turned it into rhythm, proving that culture could be a shield. 3. Unsolved Mystery. Human beings are drawn to mysteries, and few mysteries are as haunting as an unsolved series of murders. The fact that the Axeman was never caught leaves endless room for speculation. Who was he? Why did he stop? Did he die, move on, or simply tire of killing? The lack of closure keeps the case alive. Every generation rediscovers the Axeman and reimagines him anew. 4. The Setting. New Orleans itself plays a starring role in the Axeman story. Its shadowy streets, multicultural neighborhoods, and reputation for mystery make it the perfect stage for such a tale. The city's atmosphere, humid nights, dim gaslights, music drifting from dance halls, gives the Axeman legend a cinematic quality. He could not have existed anywhere else in quite the same way. The Axeman in popular culture. The Axeman has inspired countless retellings in books, documentaries, and music. Music, the 1919 sheet music, The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, remains a bizarre cultural artifact, blending crime and jazz in a way only New Orleans could. Modern jazz musicians still reference the Axeman in performances. Television. The Axeman appeared in American Horror Story, Coven 2013, portrayed as a ghostly figure tied to the city's dark past. While fictionalized, it introduced millions to the legend. Podcasts and documentaries. True crime podcasts often revisit the Axeman, dissecting theories and drawing comparisons to modern serial killers. His story remains a staple of eerie American folklore. Lessons from the Axeman. The Axeman's reign of terror reveals much about early 20th century America. It shows how immigrant communities were vulnerable to both crime and prejudice. It demonstrates the power of the press in shaping public fear. And it reminds us that unsolved crimes never truly end. They live on in memory, speculation, and culture. The victims' names may not be as well remembered as the killer, but their suffering underscores the human cost of legends. For every tale of jazz-filled streets, there is a grieving family who never saw justice. A legend that refuses to die. More than a century later, the Axeman still lurks in the imagination. Tourists hear his story on Ghost Tour. Writers use him as inspiration for novels. Musicians keep alive the tale of the night jazz saved a city. He is not just a murderer lost to history. He is a symbol of the strange alchemy by which horror becomes legend, and legend becomes folklore. The Axeman of New Orleans is proof that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are never unmasked.